All the Waxmans had horses. Our congregation was a breakaway from, I think, Hess Street, they were a breakaway of Beth Jacob. And Beth Jacob was always the premier synagogue.
Certainly in the 50s.
Prior to that, even more so. Any religious event that went on in town, like the coronation of the king or the funeral of the previous king, was held at Beth Jacob. Anything of national importance was held at Beth Jacob.
What, you mean the Jewish community used to get together to celebrate these national holidays at their synagogue?
At Beth Jacob. I remember when King George V died, they had a memorial service. When George VI was crowned king, there was a memorial service. In fact, I have the brochure somewhere in the house.
What year was that?
The king died in 36, January 36. That was George V. George VI was crowned June or May 1937.
And he must die sometime in the late 40s, early 50s, no?
George VI died June the 2nd, I think, 1952.
Sure, because maybe even a year earlier, because his daughter, Queen Elizabeth, became queen. I think, I might be wrong, I thought that she became queen in 51.
I remember, except I was born in 54. So I remember her coronation, and I was born in 54. So it was after that.
3 years for a coronation? I don't think so.
Was after 54?
It had to be, because I remember it. I remember Elizabeth's coronation.
Okay.
Yeah.
She waited about a year.
Yes, I mean, when the Frierdiker Rebbe...
The coronation of the Queen occurred on the same day as Rabbi Levine's Levaya.
Is that right?
Yes. I remember we had a rush back from the funeral to the television, from the television back to the funeral.
Interesting. Aaron, talk a little bit about different areas of town where people lived.
Generally, people lived around the synagogue. As one conservative rabbi, I'm going to paraphrase him, said recently in the last couple of weeks, that the reason why the conservative movement has lost so many from coming to shul is because they were given the option to drive to shul. The Orthodox were never given that option, so those who were Orthodox remained near their shul, Cannon Street or Hess Street. You had pockets of Jews on Cannon Street West. In fact, there was a block or two that was almost all Jews. And then you had a group of Jews on Hess Street and Peter Street, where the Hess Street shul was. And then you had a group of Jews on Jackson Street and that Bowl Street and that whole area that went to Beth Jacob. Although your family lived on Robert Street. I remember them very well. And your grandfather lived on John Street North, I think. Dolly and Frank. The office was on Robert Street, and your great-grandfather lived next door with Hilda, and next door to that was Rose Levy, who was such a sweet lady. I remember her well. And then you had groups of Jews after the war. A number of Hungarian survivors came to town, and they lived around Delaware and Gladstone, Sturton, Barnesdale Boulevard, St. Clair Boulevard. And the center was built there with the hope that Jews were going to move that area.
Right.
But all of a sudden, there was a move westward and the center was left high and dry. People came to Westdale. And
Was that lack of foresight, or what happened? They just never expected that shift to go on, or?
they never expected a shift at all. I think what the impetus could have been was a number of wartime housing was on this street and the whole south. If you walk around Haddon and Dalewood South and Stroud, you see a lot of what used to be wartime houses. They were built for the workers, the munitions workers. And the lots went very cheaply, relatively speaking. So a lot of people bought lots out here and they began to build. Joe Singer had a heyday. He designed this whole street, designed the shul, designed Winston.
Joe Singer?
Singer, the architect.
Well, where did Welkowitz fit in? I always thought that Welkowitz
Was not an architect.
Well, what did he do with the shul?
He was a foreman.
Contractor.
Oh,
Contractor, thank you.
I see.
Can you just go back? It's like these munitions workers were brought in during the war. From where?
Countryside.
What? Because there were factories in Hamilton. They would.
Oh yeah.
To build weapons for the.
And then you have the steel company and the Fasco Iron Works. I mean, they were busy day and night.
And then after the war, they went back to where they lived, and these houses were put up for sale.
No, after the war, some went back. Some bought the house. I think they went for $800. But you had to, the condition was you had to winterize it and make it look more permanent. All it was a salt box design, pitched roof, clapboard on the outside, and it was on stilts.
This is all in this neighborhood here in Westdale?
Yeah.
Was there central air?
Yes, if you open the window in the dining room.
Was there any opposition, do you think, or do you remember, to the Addis coming into here, or let's say the Beth Jacob moving into
Aberdeen?
Because I know that in Montreal, for example, I can think of a number of instances where there was really an effort to keep the synagogue out. Was anything like that experienced?
To keep it out?
To keep it out from where it eventually became.
I don't recall. I don't recall that. Beth Jacob had to move because that area was slated for demolition because of the city hall.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cannon Street had to move because we had very few members, about 60 members then. And if they didn't go to a new location, they were lost. Hess Street remained there and closed. Ferguson Avenue at the corner of Ferguson and Wilson closed.
Hess Street stayed there until quite recently.
Yes.
In fact. I never quite figured out who are the people who continued davening at Hess. I mean, Hess was an Orthodox shul.
You had the Lees. Yeah, but all the shuls were Orthodox at one time. The people were not. They weren't observant. Her great-grandfather was observant. And he was the mainstay, as her father is now, at the Beth Jacob.
But
it's rough that a synagogue has to depend on one person.
Is that normal?
No.
Is that dysfunctional?
Yes. You'll cut all that
Oh,
out.
for sure.
But there were people.
Don't give him a look like that. I'll be
There-
sued.
There were people at Hess. Just correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I don't care. There were people who davened at Hess, who wouldn't come to the Addis, right?
Well, they were Nusach Ashkenaz.
Yeah.
Beth Jacob, and they were Ashkenaz. Addis Israel and Ferguson Avenue, the Agudas Achim, were Svard Nusach.
But I mean, the people who davened at Hess Street certainly didn't stay there because they were committed to Nusach Ashkenaz. They stayed there because
They were committed to Nusach Ashkenaz. What other reason would they have had to stay there? You know, the shamas of Hess Street was my Melamed. I went there 8 years, 8 long years, from Monday to Thursday. And my school was on Mary and Wilson. And of course, we didn't have any carpools. I'd have to walk all the way to Hess and Peter Streets. And I was a little kid. And everybody did the same thing. Sometimes my Melamed wasn't there and I'd have to cool my heels out in the deep snow outside the door to the shul. And then we'd go into the shul and it was freezing cold. A glass of water froze solid. And he wouldn't make the pot-bellied stove because it wasn't his job, it was his wife's job. So I had to wait till she came in to make up the stove.
this was the shamas.
Shamas's wife, yeah.
What was his name?
Yaakov Pearl. He's buried next to my grandfather.
In Hamilton.
Yeah. He was an interesting character. He never did to me, but he would remove his belt as if he was going to hit one of the kids, but he never did. He was really a very sensitive, kindly soul. I learned very little, but he was very nice. And one day, should I give you a personal experience?
Yeah, sure.
One day, I decided it's too far to walk, and the weather was fine. I was about 8 or 9 years old. I'm going to play hooky from the Mr. Pearl. And one week went into another week, and I decided Sunday I better go. I haven't been there for 2 weeks already. I go there, and his wife says to me, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Fine. Mr. Pearl has gone to your house." Oh, yeah, I heard that. I was ready to open a grave and jump in. And he was an old man walking with a cane, had to walk all the way from Hess Street, all the way down to Cathcart Street. Anyway, I came home very reluctantly, and I opened the door. We had a flat at my grandparents' house. My grandparents lived downstairs, we lived upstairs. I go upstairs, and in our kitchen, all my family is sitting around the kitchen table. My grandparents, Mr. Pearl, my parents, and I saw them. I became absolutely hysterical, and I ran to my room, slammed the door. My mother said, "Open the door." I said, "No, I'm going to kill myself." And my father never ever laid a hand on us. And my mother persuaded me to come out of the bedroom and go back in the kitchen. And I remember Mr. Pearl said to my parents, "Don't worry, he'll never do it again." And he was right. I never did it again. But I remember, so many years, it's about 65 years ago. And I remember it as vividly today as it happened.
That's a good story. That's a great story. Did you ever remember those stories when your kids were growing up? And
Oh, they know all my stories.
no, I didn't mean that they don't know the stories. I meant that when one of your kids, the boys, might have done something comparable,
No,
not identical. That you
I don't think anyone would do anything like that.
Well, the Yiddish song that comes to mind, of course, is Mottel. You know the song Mottel.
Muttle? No.
Sure, you know the song Mottel.
I only know Muttle the operator.
Afterwards, I'll tell you a very, very interesting story about Mottel. Aaron, talk a little bit about class, social class, distinctions between wealthy people, not so wealthy people. There must have been some poor people.
There were a lot of very poor people in the community, and there were several wealthy people in the community. I keep harping back to her great-grandfather. When people needed help, for whatever reason, monetary or otherwise, many of them came to her grandfather, Jacob. Great-grandfather Jacob Goldblatt. He came here in the 1890s, and he probably was a junk peddler too, but he was a very dignified man. And he would help people. He was known to help people. People needed money or a job or finance for something. He was the one they went to. And his sons, to some extent, lived up to that, but I don't think anyone lived up to his high sense of morals.
Was there some kind of a Jewish social services in those days?
Yes.
How did it function?
That was on 54 Vine Street.
Right.
What was the person's salary who worked there, for instance?
Probably the community. The person who was in social services when I was a kid was Eva Miller.
Did she have an office?
Yes, upstairs. The community center was downstairs.
Was this like the original CJO, Council of Jewish like what was this organization called? The Central Communal?
I can't recall. I was heard it referred to as social services.
Was there an annual campaign? How did they get their money?
There was a campaign later on in years.
Was it the Jewish Welfare Fund? Is that what it was called?
Something like that, but it wasn't called that. I can't recall what it was called. But one or two of the shuls had loan society.
The community, Aaron, as we said, obviously had some people who were quite well off and others that weren't. And I would imagine that
there was a welfare system in the city.
But everybody knew, right? Everybody knew more or less. I'm asking the question. Because the community was relatively small, is it fair to say that most people knew who were those that were relatively well off?
Oh, certainly. Certainly.
But you made a very interesting point earlier on that really it had everything to do with how people carried themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So
it wasn't an arrogance. At least I don't, think that these people were arrogant when they carried themselves well.
People felt poor.
There are some people who have money today and feel very poor.
Who have money.
Yes.
And who felt poor.
Yes.
And by contrast, others who had little, who were kings of the world.
That's right. Exactly. But you see that, I think, in every society.
Yeah. I'm sure you see it today. In Hamilton.
Yes.
In 2004.
Yes.
Here's a question that really only I would care to ask. It bears absolutely no relevance to anything, but it's a really interesting question. When you said that the Beth Jacob was the premier shul in town in the 40s, 50s, you spoke about various other shuls. Was it possible to distinguish the different shuls by the kiddush that was served?
No one served Kiddush.
No,
Kiddush is,
Kiddush?
Kiddush is a new institution.
Really?
They might make a l'chaim
Uh-huh.
with an eyakichel. My bar mitzvah was held at the old shul, which wasn't so old. The whole shul was used 25 years. We've been longer here than we were at the other one. And Mrs. Perlman and Mrs. Simon were the resident cooks in town. Oh, and Simafege Goodman, those three.
Simafege.
Goodman. Yeah, she was.
Was her English name Mary Lou?
No,
Probably not.
probably not.
Simafege is much nicer.
So what my parents arranged for the Kiddush was gefilte fish and a schnapps and an eyakichel. But the eyakichel weren't like today's, they were like bowls. Have you ever seen them?
Like bowls?
Bowls,
Really?
yeah.
No.
They were they were delicious.
So when did the Kiddush come into to play?
To try and entice people to come to shul.
In the what? In the 50s?
Yes, 50s, 60s.
Interesting. So what if someone were to say to you, what do you most remember about growing up in Jewish Hamilton in the time that you grew up here? I mean, is there anything that pops into your mind that kind of is more memorable than anything else?
No, not particularly. Kids were very friendly with each other, as they are today, I think, from the various congregations.
We talked about that one period which caused a bit of an upheaval when Rabbi Green wanted to start the Hamilton Hebrew Academy.
Yes.
Can you recall any other time in the community's history that was kind of pivotal, where there was a big thing?
Kerfuffle?
Yeah, kerfuffle, and then it indicated a transition. Things started to change because of this pivotal event.
I can't think of anything.
We talk about the fragmentation in this community. You often hear that, and I know that Billy made reference to when he wrote that thing way back when, that people even 20 years ago were complaining about the fragmentation in this community. As far as you know, did that fragmentation really not exist until the Hamilton Hebrew Academy was founded?
I'm sure it existed prior to that.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yes, it wasn't a phenomenon of the academy. You had, in those days, one rabbi, Rabbi Levine, who was the chief rabbi of Hamilton. You had a rabbi at the temple, Arthur Feldman, who would pay his respects to the chief rabbi from time to time, come to his home. There wasn't the ripping that you see in the last number of years vis-a-vis the Addison, the temple, or the Addison, Beth Jacob. It wasn't like that.
What about in terms of competing organizations and fundraising, like different organizations always going to the same individuals looking for funds to support their organization?
What else is new to do today as well?
So that, in those days, like, who was doing little fundraising campaigns in those days? Today, you can think of the JNF, you can think of Federation, you can think of the various shuls, you can think of the women's organizations. Everyone's fundraising. Was it like that, like 40, 50 years ago as well?
I think so. You had many more organizations then. You had the Grand Order of Israel, which had a couple hundred members. Today they're down to maybe 100. You had the Sisterhood of Beth Jacob. You had the Sisterhood of Addis Israel. You had the National Workers Alliance, socialist Zionist group who fundraised for Israel through bazaars and what they would call a homemade table. You had the pioneer women, Hadassah, who was bigger than all of them put together. The Orthodox Jewish women did not have an organization of their own, but almost all of them were involved with Hadassah, secondly Pioneer, and thirdly National Workers Alliance. That was the Verband.
Well, who preceded Emunah?
No one.
Emunah is recent.
Emunah is a religious organization.
That's right. But
It used to be called Women's Mizrahi.
Mizrahi, there was no
But then
Mizrahi in Hamilton.
there was. Rabbi Levine brought in the Mizrahi.
Didn't you once mention that Sheila
She
carried
was
it on?
Emunah women.
Oh, okay.
That's what she did.
Okay.
You had a number of people who belonged to the National Workers Alliance, religious Jews.
Really?
Yeah.
Who?
Orgel the Sheikhet belonged. My grandfather. He didn't belong. He belonged to Mizrahi. Sorry, there are very few Mizrahis in here.
But there were people who were connected to Verband.
Yes,
What about the communists? Were there no
there was a handful.
Jewish communists as well?
Well, of course. What else are we talking about? They were our neighbors on Cathcart Street. Several of them.
Are any of them alive today?
No.
Or their descendants?
No, their descendants, yes.
Who would that be? I just found out the other day that my uncle was one of the key leaders of the Jewish communists in Montreal.
Which
Maybe now I
uncle?
understand why my
Not
father was black.
Rogoznitsky.
Beg pardon?
Not the uncle that came here.
No. I'm talking about on my father's side, not Rudnitsky, who, by the way, as you will remember, always sent in a contribution
Yes,
whenever he visited Hamilton.
to the Shamas.
He enjoyed it.
Aaron, do you remember a story about gun running for the Haganah in pre-state days?
All I remember was your father was involved. He used to ship ammunition in barrels.
Who,
Right.
your father?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the family, through Andy Noseworthy or something. Andy Noseworthy had some connection with it. He was the driver or something.
Something like that. It never was clear because even if people knew about it, and they only knew a smattering about it, there was a universal silence.
That's a fascinating story that's never been told. And there was a guy in Toronto, several people in Toronto. How far is Smith Falls from here?
I don't know.
You know, there were Hachshara farms.
Out in Smithville,
Smithville, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Smithville.
20 miles.
And I mean, I knew some of the people.
My brother was on that.
Really?
Yes.
Did you ever know
Hashem Ratzeh.
Herman in Montreal, known as Bucket?
No.
Herman?
Shomer Tzair? It was
No.
a Shomer Tzair place?
Hashem Ratzeh.
Were there Shomer Tzair people from Hamilton?
Yeah.
Can you name them?
My brother, Rose Rothstein, Shirley, oh Lord, I can't think of the last names. There were quite a few.
This is pre-state?
Yeah, 47.